I'm truly delighted to welcome all of you to today's Holocaust Living History workshop, featuring the distinguished historian Federico Finchelstein. This workshop is not only the first in 2023, but it is also the first since the start of the pandemic, 3 years ago almost, to be held in our usual location, which, as I was saying to some people, it feels a bit weird but good, right? It's really nice to see so many of our regular guests here and also many new faces. Today's event is generously sponsored by Ms. Julie Tepper-Galper. Julie began attending our workshops several years ago and has been an enthusiastic and generous supporter whose dedication to Holocaust education has been an inspiration to us all. On behalf of the Holocaust workshop, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude and appreciation to her. She has chosen to make this event possible in memory and honor of her mother, Rachel Tepper. Rachel was originally from Romania and was the only person of her entire family to survive the Holocaust due to her timely escape to Peru. Before I provide some technical details for audience participation, I would also like to acknowledge the UC San Diego Library and the Jewish Studies program for their ongoing support of the workshop. And now it is my pleasure to ask Peter Gurevich to the podium. Peter is the founding dean of the School of Global Policy and Strategy, serving from 1986 to 1998. He is an expert on international relations and comparative politics and the author of a forthcoming book of his family's escape from Nazi-occupied Europe. Please join me in welcoming Peter Gurevich. Thank you for making it, Peter.
I'm not sure that one is still yet allowed to shake hands or anything in these days, but it's my pleasure to be here and to introduce our speaker tonight. I think you know some of the basic facts. He is a professor at the New School for Social Research in New York. He began his education in Argentina, and then he got a master's and PhD in history from Cornell University. And he taught at Brown for a while, which makes me very happy because I have one child who went to Brown and another child who's now a professor at Brown. So he has a very impressive record of publication on fascism. You should look it up. It's really quite extraordinary. And it's not only historical from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, but it takes us into the present time. It's very appropriate for this evening's lecture because it makes the very difficult framework of staying in the period and not violating in the sense of trying to understand then, but it also does something that I'm sure all of us are doing, which is making comparisons to what is going on today. Just to mention some of the books that he's published, A Brief History of Fascist Lies, the University of California Press is a particularly wonderfully appropriate thing because we are all very struck by they tell these lies and how do they get away with it? Doesn't everybody know that they're lies? And so an exploration of what is going on there, how do they get away with it, is interesting. And from Fascist, the newest book, or one of the newest, I don't know what is the newest book because there are so many of them, Fascist Mythologies, History and Politics of Unreason, in Borges, Freud, and Schmidt at Columbia in 2022, which sounds quite remarkable. There's also an extraordinary list of translations of the languages that many of these books have been published into, so it's a very impressive record, and so it is impressively well prepared to plunge into the difficult debates today. And I think what's interesting is precisely this point that I alluded to is, how do you talk about something that on the one hand we think of as the past, from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and on the other hand there's a constant reference to this, to today. And so how do you remain true to your commitment as a historian, which is to make descriptions to the past, and yet on the other hand, try to make sense out of the reference to it today. And I think that there's another element of it that I feel particularly attached to, which is how do you compare one country to another? I professionally, in my field, I'm a comparativist. That is, I have one country in particular that I have done a lot of work on, which is France. But I've always, even France, I always thought of in comparative terms. I've never liked the idea of France as a civilization. We're describing the civilization. I don't think you can make sense out of any one country if you don't try to relate it to others and try to think about what's similar and different. And I think that our speaker today has a very deep sense of that in the things that I've read of his that are like that, that on the one hand, he wants to locate it, on the other hand, he wants to make the comparisons, and I think that's exactly what we need. I think, and one of the themes he has, he talks a lot about ideology, and I'm really looking forward to what he has to say about that today. I'd like to hear him explain what is it, does he mean it as an ideology, is he using it as an explanation of what people are doing, or is he using it descriptively as a way of describing their kinds of behavior, in which case then I wonder, well, why do they have this ideology? They believe these things which we know are false, so then makes us wonder, well, why do they believe them? What explanation? Can we have an explanation of why people believe false things, or are we only in a situation of describing that they do believe false things? I think this is very difficult. I think people are not sure about how we have an explanation of why people believe false things. I think one of the difficult things in the comparisons, problem of comparison, I think one of his biggest problems is, in the problem of comparisons, is there are always, whenever you compare, there are always exceptions and false comparisons. For example, in fascism and Hitler, obviously Germany at that time is one of the classic locations of it. But how generic is that, and how generic is Hitler for the most conspicuous part of his fascism, which he was a complete lunatic maniac? I think Joel Dimsdale, having written a book on that, would agree that that guy was a maniac. I don't know what criteria you would use, but I say he's a maniac. Whatever criteria you're going to use, he's a maniac. Somebody who goes around and wants to kill that many people is just a maniac. And so does that mean that fascists are people who want to kill Jews? Well, I would say no, I don't think it is. I think there are plenty of places around the world which we would call fascist for many reasons, and most of them do not want to go around killing Jews. So if we define fascism, which I think I hear many people do this, fascism is a characteristic, the definition of fascism is people who want to kill Jews. I think this is not a good method. And I'm very struck by this, and frequently we see this happening with Ukraine. When I hear people criticize Putin, they have many things to criticize Putin about, but when they hear Putin say that Ukraine is controlled by fascists, and they wish to reject that proof, the way they reject that proof is by saying it couldn't possibly be controlled by fascists because Zelensky, the president, is Jewish, and therefore, since he's the president, it couldn't be controlled by fascists. I'm sorry, as a historian, this makes me very upset. I have to turn down the television and walk around the room to calm myself down, because the fact that they've elected Zelensky does not do anything for us, because fascism is not to be equated with simply being anti-Semitic. They could easily have elected Zelensky and be run by fascists. It's not a proof. And so I think that once we start realizing that it's more complicated, it helps us to understand the questions that many of us are asking. Well, who is a fascist? Is Trump a fascist? Bolsonaro? Orban? Which of these people that we hear a lot about? Putin himself. Many people are saying, the real fascist out here is the guy who's calling the kettle black. It's Putin's the fascist out there. This is what Snyder, that authority at Yale, is saying. Many people are saying that. So there's an interesting discussion to be had about those kinds of things, and important ones. And I think we're very fortunate tonight that there are very few people around in this world who are writing who are as qualified and prepared and have worked so seriously on these things as Federico Finchelstein, and I'm sure I mispronounced your name, though we discussed it for 10 minutes, how properly to pronounce it, but that's not going to protect me. But he is, I think, one of the leaders internationally in what I would call comparative fascist studies. So I'm very eager to hear his thoughts on this topic. And so join me in welcome Federico Finchelstein and a terrific topic of what's fascism got to do with it, the ideological origins of the Holocaust. Federico.
Thank you very much for for this very generous presentation. I mean, I would also like to thank Julie Tepper-Galper for having facilitated this meeting and her support for this workshop. It's really a pleasure to be here, and as Professor Gurevich was saying, and also Susan Hillman, who I also would like to thank for having invited me. We don't do these things much, at least me. Like, I haven't been in another American university for a couple of many months, I would say, perhaps half a year, and there is this tendency to do only Zoom, which I think is very problematic. I don't know why. It might be the way we are wired or the way many of us are wired, but I don't learn as much. Like, even when I talk, I don't learn as much, and so, I mean, being here is really rewarding, and I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. Of course, I'm from Argentina, and we talk a lot. So that goes against what I just said, because I would have also to restrain myself. I could talk for 3 hours without even planning it. So there is a tension there that we will try to resolve. The question, of course, I mean, Professor Gurevich was asking the questions that all of us are asking, and we try to arrive, in our cases, from our fields of expertise, because, of course, everybody is asking what's going on. And the second, or the related question to that, is what is new about it. And of course, this is a question that many of the current, I would say, I don't want to enter the fascism debate that, in such an explicit way, but I will. Okay, so what people that are related to the history of fascism, people like Bolsonaro and Trump, claim to be totally new. In fact, the former president of the US called our present time the age of Trump. I mean, this is, of course, a symptom of his narcissism. But on the other hand, we should ask how true it is that this is new. And of course, in history is continuity, but also change. So an historian will try to see the different angles of the question. So to claim that something is entirely new is just propaganda. I mean, that's what these people do. They are good at it. To claim that something is no new at all is not a historical view, because again, there are connections with the past. In fact, that's why most of us historians are historians. We don't collect facts from the past. We are not antiquarians, but we want to understand the present. I mean, my drive to do history is the present, and at different presents, we ask different questions to the past. That's what we do, and I will a little bit later talk about this, because this is a way to understand why these issues that we are talking about today, which is fascism and the Holocaust, were not necessarily connected for so many years, perhaps even the entire 20th century. Most people working on these two fields of knowledge, the research and study of the Holocaust, the research and study of fascism, they were not connecting the dots. Not only that, they were rejecting that sort of connection. So at that time, there were different problems, and they had their reasons for not asking those questions or even rejecting those questions. I will come back to this. So in order to understand what happened, we need to understand also our present, in the sense that these are the questions that we are asking. And this is why we ask them. Regarding fascism, the question of the Holocaust is also central, because it kind of, in my opinion anyway, it puts fascism in the place it deserves. Because once you connect fascism to the Holocaust, you cannot take this very problematic view, which is, listening to the two sides, or this both-sidism, that, that there are good things or bad things about one problem, or as the former president of the US said, even among Nazis there are fine people. So this is, of course, extremely problematic, and looking at the Holocaust in its connection to fascism, I think, already provides a correction to this really problematic view. A view that not only enables the attacks against democracy in the present, but also leads us, or misleads us to, to see the past in ways that do not correspond to what happened, basically. So the question is not really whether, of course, fascism is good or bad, but the question is, and it was throughout the years in terms of this relationship between fascism and the Holocaust, is fascism how bad it was. And once you, of course, connect it with the Holocaust, it would have been difficult to say that it wasn't really bad. So that's why, these questions had an impact in that sense. This, in fact, created, and for different reasons, different politicians, but also, sadly, historians, were engaged in this myth of a benign form of fascism vis-a-vis Nazism. Because, of course, if you are not like the Nazis, you have to be better. I mean, the Nazis being the most, and it's true, the most extreme example of extreme right politics, which is to say, to a great extent, fascism. That is not a definition of fascism, but fascism certainly is that. And this is the context in which, again and again, the question of fascism and the Holocaust comes to the fore, and it was answered, and it will be answered, certainly in different ways, as contexts are changing as well. Of course, in our current context, the question is certainly way more important than it was before. And in a way, we are way more connected in asking these questions. What is the future of our democracy? Are we going to be, suffering in terms of, diversity and pluralism? And these questions kind of bypass the many decades that we live and our parents lived before and connects us to the 1930s and 1940s. So, I mean, in a way, it's very organic that we connect to those times. And in fact, we know that the general that was like the most important military person in America at the time, when he saw the events of January 6th, he thought about those times. And that is not a lack of context. That I don't think that is a ahistorical view. I mean, and again, as Professor Gurevich was saying, the question is how you make the connection. If it's a way to see parallels, is one thing. If it's a total conflation between past and present, then it becomes problematic. I mean, and then on the other hand, you see even historians, some of them very famous, saying, well, this is not like the Nazis, because, and this is a kind of, I will simplify it, because this guy doesn't have Hitler's mustache, or it's not Hitler. Or, I mean, nobody says about the mustache, but the idea is that this is not Hitler. Well, of course it's not Hitler. Hitler was Hitler, and this guy is someone else. But the connections are there. The question is how similar, how different, how much continuity, how much change. So, because in fact, what is going on in the present and what went on in the past, this is part of the same history. And you can call this history the history of fascism, if you want. You can call this history the history of xenophobia, if you want, or you can call it the history of those that are against democracy. And again, or against liberal democracy or constitutional democracy. And then you see the connections if you want to see them. But this is not a question of, the will to see them, but rather to focus our study or to focus our analysis in those connections. So this is not about the uniqueness of the past or fascism or the Holocaust, but about these global connections. Now, I will switch now to two dimensions of this issue of fascism and the Holocaust. Before all that, because you might be wondering, and there are many definitions out there, I mean, what is fascism? I mean, I could talk for hours on that, and I would be also not very satisfied because it's a difficult question to answer, and yet many of my works, I try to answer that question by problematizing it. I mean, to say, okay, this is very difficult to explain, but we can understand it better by seeing all these angles. And yet, in the book I'm writing, I'm supposed to deliver the final draft in a few months. I really forced myself to focus on 4 things that fascism was about. Fascism was many things, but these 4 things, other political ideologies or movements or regimes did not have in the same way. I was asking this question to fascism because then, I mean, I published this book a couple of years ago, which is From Fascism to Populism in History. And what I say in this book is that after 1945, people that were fascists, at least many of them, not most of them, the ones that still like Hitler and Mussolini and they wanted to continue that project in the same way, we call them neo-Nazis, neo-fascists. They were a political minority until recently, and they were never successful in politics until recently. So the people that were smarter or more pragmatic among them changed. So the ones that remained like that never achieved power. They always were like a political opposition and so on. And that's another history. But the history of populism is the history, at least in its beginnings, of people that used to be authoritarian fellow travelers of fascism or even fascists and decided after 1945 that it was time to change. Whether they meant it, they felt it, or they wanted to be in power, that's a difficult question to answer. Like Erich Hobsbawm, this famous historian of the 19th and 20th century, said, well, with the advent of mass politics, once we have mass